Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to be talking about the first Postmaster General of the United States. Now before you go anywhere, because that sounds real boring, we're also going to be talking about the first executive mansion in the history of the United States. Today we're going to be discussing the life of founder Samuel Osgood. Now Samuel Osgood was from Massachusetts, and by the young age of 27, he had already established himself to the point where he was elected to the local first the colonial assembly, and then when things started getting heated with Great Britain, the provincial assembly in Massachusetts. And he was also chosen to lead his local militia, which, when the Battle of Lexington Concord broke out, Osgood did lead a militia to Lexington and Concord and help chase the British back into Boston, where they were laid siege on. Now, he quickly became an aide-de-camp to General Artemas Ward, who was, as we've discussed before, the default commander-in-chief of the Continental Army before there was a Continental Army and before George Washington had the opportunity to be named commander-in-chief. So anyway, Samuel Osgood is here right at the beginning of the war, serving in the highest circles of the military, but he does leave the forces soon after that to return to the provincial assembly. And he plays an important role in helping Massachusetts write its first constitution. He stays as a member of the assembly. He's elected to the Massachusetts Board of War, which is different than the Continental Congress's Board of War, as we've discussed before. Not only did the Continental Congress have the Continental Army fighting in the Revolution, but each state had its own different assembly and its own militia or armies that were being run. So Samuel Osgood was one of the people running the war from the perspective of Massachusetts. We're not going to get too deep in on that today, but in his position, Osgood was sent for 2 years to the Continental Congress to represent Massachusetts on a more grand scale. And his efforts at the state level didn't go unnoticed, because he was chosen by the Continental Congress to serve as a commissioner of the Treasury, which helped organize the finances of the young nation. And his office at this time was in New York City, so he moved to New York City and bought a big fancy house. And then when George Washington was elected the first president, first of all, he chose Samuel Osgood as the inaugural Postmaster General of the United States, which today we don't really talk about Postmaster General very much, but at the time it was an amazingly important position because you were essentially in charge of communication throughout the young nation. And on top of that, George Washington took up residence in Samuel Osgood's house, known as the Osgood House. And since it's the first house that the president was living in when the capital was in New York, it means that Samuel Osgood's house was the first White House. Though it probably wasn't white, we'll call it the first executive mansion. So he had pretty much simultaneously, his house was the first executive mansion, and he ran mass communications throughout the United States. A pretty important position, a pretty important guy that we simply don't talk about too much anymore. Now, Osgood only spent about 2 years in this position, and then resigned back to his private practice, but he was, several years later, when Thomas Jefferson became president, there was not a lot of crossover between the Washington administration through Adams to Jefferson. Now, Osgood didn't serve under Adams. Like I said, he had left just 2 years into Washington's presidency, but clearly he put service to country over party, because when Thomas Jefferson became president, he actually appointed Samuel Osgood as the collector of the position is called Naval Officer. I apologize. Naval Officer of the Port of New York, which means he was essentially captain of the police department. I don't know how else to compare it to today. That's not a precise comparison, but he was basically in charge of making sure that the naval yard was not interfered with or attacked in any way. And closing in on the end of his life, he was also chosen as the first president of Citibank of New York, which was an early bank in New York City. And that company today is known as Citigroup. I know you expected me to say Citibank. That's why I keep looking over to my right to make sure I say Citigroup, which is still a vibrant and successful bank to my understanding. Don't know a lot about modern banking, but to my understanding, it is still a vibrant bank, and Samuel Osgood was the first president of that organization. Clearly he did a good job, because here we are 200 plus years later, and it's still around. So that in brief is the life of Samuel Osgood, the first Postmaster General in the history of the United States. I sure hope you liked this video. If you did, please hit like. That would be great. If you want to see more videos, you just stumbled onto this for the first time, put out videos 5 days a week, please hit subscribe. I'm going to let you go. I will come back to you with another founder tomorrow.